Hello, this video will be about events of 2014 in Mariupol, because some people don't even know that back then the city rebelled against new Ukrainian nationalist government. In this video I will give a detailed chronology of events from February till July, and then I will talk about the consequences of this rebellion, about Ukrainian war crimes, and about life in Mariupol with Ukraine. Some information before I'll start. Back then I lived in Donetsk, and I moved to Mariupol only in August 2014, 2 months after Ukraine suppressed the uprising. I was 9 years old, so in this video I used only facts from open sources, both pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian, and I also asked some people who was in Mariupol back then. It wasn't easy to find information and material. A lot of material was deleted, especially from Ukrainian sources and from YouTube. There are a lot of videos from May 9 and May 11, but there are much fewer videos from other days, and the material is not structured. Many important events happened at that time. There were rebellions across all of eastern Ukraine, tragedy in Odessa, suppressed protests in Kharkov and Zaporozhye, but today I will talk only about Mariupol. You can also watch my interview with a man who took part in that uprising and guarded the captured city council. It's really interesting. Now let's start talking about these events. Everything started after Euromaidan. It's a very complicated topic, but in short, government in Ukraine has changed after massive protests in Kiev. I will not talk about the reasons, I'll just say that many people in the new government were far right, often Nazis, and nationalism became an official course of Ukraine. New government was also against any connection with Russia. Participants of Euromaidan demolished Soviet monuments and wanted Ukraine to reject its Soviet past completely and stop celebrating Victory Day. And many of Maidan activists were against Russian language. Most people in the eastern Ukraine didn't like new government, and I think the main factor were Nazis. There were many of them among Maidan supporters and even in the government, and they were very radical. In my last video about Ukraine, I told more about them and their symbols. So, massive protests started along all of eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, Lugansk, Odessa, Kharkov, Zaporozhye oblasts, and of course in Crimea. In Mariupol on February 23, a first anti-Maidan rally took place. Participants carried Ukrainian flags and St. George ribbons. At that time the Ukrainian flag wasn't associated with nationalists, so protesters used it. Few months later, pro-Russian people in Donbass started to consider Ukrainian flag as a symbol of the enemy. So protesters went to the city council building. At the request, deputies and the city mayor, Yuri Khotlubey, came out to them. Protesters attached a St. George ribbon to the mayor clothing as a sign that the mayor shares their demands. On March 1st, an anti-fascist rally took place. There was a clash with Ukrainian nationalists, but without casualties. By the way, at the beginning, not many protesters wanted to join Russia. Majority were federalists. They wanted Ukraine to become a federation and the Donetsk region to become part of it with its own regional rights and Russian as a regional language. There were communists who understood that new far-right government will soon suppress them. There were just ordinary people who were against Nazism but had nothing against Ukraine. Some simply wanted Ukraine to remain friends with Russia. People didn't know that Kiev government will declare them terrorists and decide to crush them without compromise. But in the first months, protesters were called federalists. Before I will move on, I want to remind you that this channel is only sponsored by you. So if you want to support my work, link is in the description. On March 2nd, at the session of the Mariupol City Council, activist Oleg Butsko demanded that decisions taken by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine in Kiev not be recognized. As a result of discussions, the council decided to appeal to the Verkhovna Rada with a number of demands like disarmament of illegal formations, decentralization of power, and expansion of the powers of local councils. During the session of the city council, 2 rallies were held on opposite sides of the city council building, one in support of unitary Ukraine, the second by opponents of the Kiev authorities. The number of people gathered at the second rally was much more than the number of supporters of a unitary Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Donetsk, the protesters already started to capture administrative buildings. On March 5th, two rallies were held near the city council building, about 500 supporters of Ukraine's integrity and 1,000 federalists. On March 8th, a 5,000-strong rally was held in Mariupol, organized by the Communist Party of Ukraine and representatives of the Anti-Fascist Committee. They demanded a referendum on the federalization of Ukraine, determining the right of residents of the Donetsk region to self-determination and the choice between joining the customs union and European Union. On March 15th, several public and political movements like the Anti-Fascist Committee, the People's Liberation Movement of Ukraine, the People of Mariupol, the People's Committee of Donbass, as well as the Russian Bloc of Ukraine Party and the Communist Party of Ukraine, organized a joint rally where they put forward demands for the organization and holding of referendums on the status of the Donetsk region within Ukraine on a federal basis, and for support of the course towards joining the customs union and comprehensive integration with the fraternal peoples of the CIS countries. About 1,500 people with flags of the Russian Federation, communist red banners, and black and orange flags gathered near the city council building. The crowd booed the mayor of Mariupol, Yuri Khotlobey, who tried to speak, and the rally participants shouted, "The mayor must resign." Then the protesters went to the Roshen building, which belonged to Poroshenko, where they broke down the gates and entered the factory, and demanded that the management demonstrate that there were no people from the western Ukraine on the factory premises. Some of the protesters also went to the site of the planned rally for the integrity of Ukraine. Despite the cancellation of the rally itself, about 40 people with Ukrainian flags gathered at the expected location. Police officers stood between the supporters of the integrity of Ukraine and the supporters of the referendum, so there were no consequences. Also on March 15th, in the city of Volnovakha, local residents stopped a column of Ukrainian military vehicles that was moving to suppress protesters in Mariupol. On March 16, a rally in support of the referendum took place near the city council. About 300 people gathered in the rain, carrying Russian flags, and demanded the resignation of the mayor. On the same day, around 50 people used cars to block a military border unit, suspecting that its personnel and assigned equipment were being relocated to the Dnepropetrovsk for reorganization. Due to the incident in Volnovakha, the city's residents were alarmed. Several activists set up a checkpoint at the entrance of the city and began inspecting passing vehicles. The organizers of the checkpoint were detained. On March 18, a rally was held near the city council building in support of the referendum. Protesters waving Russian and Communist Party flags removed the entrance door from its hinges and sent 5 of their representatives to a round-table discussion taking place inside the building at that time. The meeting at the city council, attended by the representatives of political parties, public organizations and rally participants, addressed the issue of holding a referendum or conducting a sociological survey. Any formal decisions were scheduled to be made during the upcoming city council session on March 25. City Mayor Yuri Khotlobey issued a statement announcing his decision not to run for another term. Local elections, he said, should be held within the next 4 or 5 months. Meanwhile, rally activists moved to the bridge over the Kalmius River, where they blocked public transport for about an hour and prevented a detained vehicle carrying border guards from leaving the city. On March 22, a large rally in support of Yanukovych as the legitimate president of Ukraine took place near the Mariupol city council building. Over 1,000 people gathered, without Russian flags, but with numerous posters. An appeal was recorded to Ukraine's first president, urging him to ensure the implementation of Ukraine's constitution and protect Ukrainian citizens from violations of their rights. On March 23rd, another rally in support of President Yanukovych and against criminal prosecutions of Mariupol activists took place near the Mariupol city council building. A protest camp consisting of 3 tents appeared near the city council building with organized food supply and water delivery. For nighttime heating, activists burned firewood in barrels. By the next day, the number of tents had grown to 9, with a kitchen and other infrastructure established. The March 23rd rally's resolution expressed no confidence in city mayor Yuri Khotlobey, so protesters elected Dmitry Kuzmenko as Mariupol's new mayor. The people's mayor, Dmitry Kuzmenko, confirmed his readiness to temporarily lead the city. On March 24th, due to threats of seizure, the city council session scheduled for March 25th was postponed indefinitely. During a roundtable discussion held that day, representatives of political parties and the public addressed the current situation in the city. The demands from deputies of the Party of Regions remained unchanged. Decentralization of the power, adoption of laws establishing municipal police and granting official status to the Russian language, suppression of fascist manifestations and mandatory community approval of candidates for positions in the government and police. People's Mayor Dmitry Kuzmenko stated that the protesters' position remained hard: a referendum and federalization of Donetsk Oblast. March 28th, City Council deputies decided to support conducting a sociological survey in Mariupol, establish a public council under the City Council, and appoint 2 representatives to the Executive Committee. In their appeal to the Verkhovna Rada, the deputies proposed granting Russian language status as a second language state, adopting a law on municipal police, and discussed the centralization of power and budget allocations. Speaking at the session, Kuzmenko declared his distrust of the new Kiev government, demanded a referendum be held, and called for the disarmament of the Ukrainian army to prevent war with Russia. He also stated there would be no forceful seizure of the city council building. On the night of April 5th, Mariupol's people mayor Kuzmenko was detained by SBU officers. A protest rally supporting the detained Kuzmenko began outside the city administration building. Then demonstrators marched to the SBU headquarters and arrived at the prosecutor's office. Protesters smashed first-floor windows, threw the eggs, and forced their way inside. After failing to locate the prosecutor, they were pushed out by the law enforcement officers. The crowd then moved to the city council building, where they broke windows and forced open a door. Police attempted to block the protesters, leading to skirmishes. Criminal cases were initiated regarding the seizure of the prosecutor's office and the attack on Mariupol City Council. According to SBU statements, Kuzmenko was transported to an SBU detention facility in Kiev, with criminal proceedings open against him for allegedly threatening Ukraine's territorial integrity and inviolability. On April 7th, the Donetsk People's Republic was proclaimed in Donetsk. This received immediate support from the protest camp near Mariupol City Council. Protesters discussed men from the camp having departed for Donetsk that morning, with calls for reinforcements. All men were offered to enlist for a planned second convoy that evening. According to media reports, several hundred Mariupol residents actively participated in the seizure of the Donetsk Regional State Administration. On April 9th, Mariupol Mayor Khotlubey issued a public address to residents stating that Mariupol stands for a united and indivisible Ukraine. That same night, Molotov cocktails were used against the protest camp near the city council building. Earlier in that day, a nationalist march featuring Ukrainian flags had taken place in support of the Ukraine's territorial integrity. The tensions escalated on April 11th, when several guys with bats attacked participants at a pro-Ukrainian rally, leaving 3 people injured. On April 13th, pro-federalization protesters occupied Mariupol city administration building after police was forced to retreat against approximately 1,000 demonstrators. Protesters replaced Ukrainian flags with flag of Donetsk Oblast, a red flag, and the DPR banner. Protesters made high barricades reinforced with barbed wire at the building's entrance and placed a Donetsk People's Republic banner on the facade, declaring the city DPR territory. They announced the dissolution of the city council's deputy corps. Police was in full combat readiness on the opposite side of the building, but it took no action. Around 4 p.m., several hundred guys with bats attacked a small nationalist rally outside the Mariupol police headquarters. 9 were injured, 6 of them required intensive care, including city council deputy. Most of them later returned to the occupied administration building. Mayor Khotlubey offered negotiations and called for preventing bloodshed. By evening, protesters announced the election of 75 new local council deputies. Denis Kuzmenko, brother of detained people's mayor Dmitry Kuzmenko, led talks with the police. The self-proclaimed deputies held their first session, electing DPR representative Vyacheslav Kuklin as people's mayor, until Dmitry Kuzmenko's release. After the capture of the city council, the tent city near it was dismantled. In the first days, no looting was allowed in the building. The occupiers of the building invited the city council employees to walk in their places. At the same time, the mayor Hotlubey stated that the main problem was the employees' access to the building and sent his representatives to negotiate. Hotlubey supported the actions of the police, who did not use force and allowed the building to be seized in order to avoid bloodshed, and calling for negotiation, was ready to provide several offices in the building for the protesters. The activists who seized the building declared that it was impossible to live in Ukraine with a fascist government and were waiting for help from Russia. The occupiers had no intention of voluntarily leaving the city council. According to one of the activists, there were several professional hunters in the building who had weapons. On April 16 at night, an attempt was made to seize a military unit, an internal troops battalion, with armed force during which Federalists were shot. There are two versions, pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. According to pro-Ukrainian version, protesters tried to storm military unit to capture arms. There were provocators, and they were very aggressive. Some people in grey uniform arrived, they started to shoot and throw explosives and molotovs on the territory of military unit. According to military, protesters captured checkpoint and attempted to go further. National Guard of Ukraine made warning shots and protesters retreated. After negotiations with the demand to come out to the people and hand over their weapons, either provocateurs appeared and started throwing Molotov cocktails again, or shooting started from behind the gates from military. According to pro-Russian version, protesters were peaceful, they had no arms, and they just asked military to join them. The rally was led by mothers of conscripts, whose terms of service had expired, but they were still being held in the unit without any explanation. In addition, one of the mothers said that soldiers were not being fed in the unit. Deputy head of the DPR press service, Kirill Rudenko, later explained that the DPR had information that one of the military units in Mariupol was ready to go over to the side of the Donetsk People's Republic, but this was just a provocation. One way or another, the results of the conflict are 3 killed, 13 wounded, 77 detained. In addition, according to the protesters, the real number of dead is 19 people, and the authorities are deliberately hiding the real number of dead. To neutralize the attackers, the Omega special forces were deployed to Mariupol. The mayor and city council members issued statements condemning the attack on the military unit and agreeing that the attackers' main goal was to seize weapons. Checkpoints controlled by police officers were set up at all entrances to Mariupol. On April 21st, a rally for the unity of Ukraine was held. It was organized by the pro-Ukrainian Mariupol People's Militia and pro-Ukrainian activists. It was claimed at the rally that the People's Militia was being formed, the purpose of which was to ensure the security of pro-Ukrainian forces in the situation of the inaction of the Mariupol's police, and it numbered about 120 people. On April 23rd, another pro-Ukrainian rally took place near the drama theater, where about 1,000 people gathered. The mayor Hotlubey spoke at the rally. Euromaidan activists who came from Kiev took part in the rally. By the way, my neighbor told me that back then he's seen a lot of young people who came from the western Ukraine. On the night of April 24th, about 30 pro-Ukrainian activists wearing masks and carrying bats attempted to take control of the city administration buildings occupied by supporters of federalization. As a result, 5 people who were in the city administration building were injured. After the police arrived, the attackers fled. According to the Ukrainian Interior Minister Arsen Avakov, civil activists from the city took part in the attempt to liberate the Mariupol City Council. Criminal proceedings were opened. Early in the morning, Hotlubey with police officers visited the city council and held talks with representatives of the DPR about activists leaving the building, possibly partially. However, no concrete results were achieved, the police cordon was lifted, and the Russian flag was raised on the flagpole again. Later there were negotiations between Hotlubey and DPR activists. Mayor asked them to leave the city council building, they refused, but offered employees of the city council return to their workplaces, except for mayor himself. DPR activists also promised to not seize any other buildings. Also, activists allowed police to inspect council building. During the inspection, law enforcement officers found more than 250 bottles of Molotov cocktails, baseball bats, homemade bats, and 2 pistols of an unknown type. In the evening, a rally was held near the city council, which gathered about 1,000 DPR supporters. The protesters demanded that the police immediately deal with those who attacked the city council, and representatives of the Mariupol police reported on the investigative actions being carried out. At a round table with representatives of political parties held the same day, Denis Kuzmenko called on city council employees to return to their workplaces in the building seized by DPR. According to him, it was necessary to prepare for the referendum on May 11th, in which city hall staff could help. However, the secretary of the city council said that it's possible to return there only after repairs have been carried out. On April 26, an exhibition of the Essence of Time movement was opened in front of the city council about the cooperation of Ukrainian nationalists with the fascists during World War II, with Western intelligence services during the Cold War, and about the participations of radical nationalists in Euromaidan. On April 28, the head of the city called for a peaceful resolution to the conflict at his press conference and said that he was ready to resign if the city council building was returned by force. On the same day, the first press conference of DPR representatives took place, chaired by Denis Kuzmenko. The discussion was about holding a referendum on the state independence of the Donetsk People's Republic, scheduled for May 11th. DPR representatives said that the referendum was under threat of disruption due to the fact that Ukrainian troops had encircled Mariupol and were controlling the situation in the city, and an armed conflict was possible. On April 29th, a meeting of the DPR activists with the head of the UN Human Rights Mission in Donetsk Oblast took place in the large hall of the city council. The activists explained their position, demanded a ban on nationalist organizations in Ukraine, and the release of political prisoners, in particular Dmitry Kuzmenko. Also that day there were reports of possible preparations for the seizure of the city by DPR activists, and on April 30th, as a result of small rallies at the city's district administrations, DPR flags appeared on the buildings of all district administrations. According to the press service of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, the flags were installed by DPR activists independently, without the sanction of district leaders. There was no talk of seizing the entire buildings. On May 1st, a May Day march and rally took place in Mariupol under the flags of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Communist Party of Ukraine flags. Many participants had St. George's ribbons. According to various estimates, 3,000 to 5,000 people chanted referendum and Russia. Representatives of the communists demanded to deprive the oligarchs of power from city-forming enterprises, and DPR activists reported the removal of city law enforcement agency heads from their positions, and that their places were taken by people appointed by Kyiv. Also on May 1st, by order of the Minister of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, Police Colonel Valery Andreshuk was appointed head of the Mariupol Main Directorate. Later he played an important role in the events of May 9th. On the same day, reports appeared that Andreshuk had resigned under pressure from DPR activists who came to the building of Mariupol Police Department and demanded that Andreshuk attach a St. George ribbon to his clothes, which he refused. After this, DPR activists installed DPR flags over the buildings of the city police, the SBU, and the prosecutor's office. On May 2nd happened the tragedy in Odessa where pro-Russian activists were burned alive. At that time, fightings between Ukrainian army and DPR militia had already begun in other cities. Kiev government in their media replaced words local residents and militia with words terrorists and separatists, and there are no negotiations with terrorists. Kiev didn't make a single attempt to reach an agreement, only to crush Donbas people. On the evening of May 3rd, shooting began in the center of Mariupol, which turned into a night armed conflict. The reasons and course of events are unclear. Local residents believed that the active phase of, as Ukraine called this, anti-terrorist operation had begun in the city. In particular, it was reported that unknown people in black uniforms and masks without identification marks were storming the city administration building. Car tires were set on fire, then the Privatbank building and a car caught fire, the windows in a fur coat shop were broken, and the office of presidential candidate Petr Poroshenko was ransacked. At the same time, no people with gunshot wounds were admitted to city hospitals overnight. According to doctors, 4 people were injured, but nothing serious. According to the official version of the police, at 3 p.m. on May 3rd, several citizens arrived at the checkpoint of the armed forces of Ukraine in the village of Rybatskoye with food for the military. The food contained sleeping pills, and after 5 servicemen were helpless, they and their weapons, rifles, a grenade launcher, and a machine gun were captured by about 20 people in 3 cars. The captured servicemen and weapons were taken to the city council, controlled by the DPR. The police held negotiations and the hostages were released. However, the activists refused to give their weapons, and shots and arson began. As a result of the night events, 3 citizens were detained on suspicions of arson, but the weapons were never returned. On May 4th, a video message from Mariupol rebels appeared on the internet, declaring that they were moving forward to help the fight in Slaviansk. Here is the video.
Уважаемые мариупольцы, земляки, мы все с болью в сердце следим за событиями, которые происходят в городах Славянске, Краматорске, Луганске, Одессе. Народное ополчение Мариуполя выдвигается в помощь и поддержку сражающемуся Славянску. Победа будет за нами. Мы вместе все сила.
Leaflets calling for support for the state independence of the DPR in the referendum on May 11th began to be distributed through the city. On May 6th, there were reports about shootouts in the airport area, which were perceived as the beginning of an assault of the city. Eyewitnesses reported the appearance of men in black, who turned out to be a paramilitary formation of Oleg Lyashko. In Ukraine, after the Maidan, many military formations appeared, sponsored by businessmen. In fact, it was private military. Supporters of federalization began to burn tires near the city council on Lenin and Nakhimov avenues. In the evening, a battle between DPR rebels and fighters of the Azov Special Forces battalion took place near a checkpoint in the Mangush area. As a result of the battle, one rebel was killed, and DPR Defense Minister Igor Kakidzanov was taken prisoner. There was also a report of a shootout at a checkpoint near the village of Agrobaza. On the morning of May 7th, Igor Kakidzanov was interrogated by Oleg Lyashko personally. On the night after May 6, armed clashes between local security forces and DPR supporters occurred in the center of Mariupol. At the same time, fighters from Lyashko's detachment attacked a rebel base in the outskirts of Mariupol, where they seized an arsenal of weapons. On the morning of May 7th, Ukrainian security forces cleared the Mariupol city council of activists using tear gas. The activists who were in the city council were arrested. May 9th, the Victory Day, is remembered in the history of Mariupol as the bloodiest day in 2014. In the city center there were sporadic clashes between security forces and rebels. During the confrontation, the rebels captured one broken infantry fighting vehicle and towed it to the Mariupol city council. A representative of the Operational Command South, Colonel Andrei Derman, and the commander of the National Guard unit were seriously wounded, and the deputy commander of the 1st Battalion of the Territorial Defense of the Dnipropetrovsk region was killed. On the same day, Ukrainian troops killed and wounded a number of participants in a peaceful demonstration on the occasion of Victory Day and other civilians. There was also a threat of an IFV running over the demonstrators. The incident was filmed on video, which became famous. Also very important events happened at the police station. There are 2 versions, pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian. According to pro-Ukrainian perspective, pro-Russian protesters and militias occupied the city police department in Mariupol on the morning of May 9th. Some local police officers assisted the protesters during the takeover and later clashed with internal troops, who opened fire on the building using heavy machine guns from APCs. According to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, 60 separatists armed with automatic weapons took part in the attack on the city police department. The Ukrainian contingent was then reinforced by police, as well as the Omega unit of the National Guard. Soldiers, tanks, armored personnel carriers and military vehicles spotted in the city. Pro-Russian protesters attempted to stop the advance of military equipment through the city, however, their actions were unsuccessful. Ukrainian security forces were sent to the city police department in an attempt to recapture it from the militias, and during the assault the building caught fire. Pro-Russian demonstrators, after the clashes, built barricades in the city center. Interior Minister of Ukraine Arsen Avakov, by the way a Nazi who sponsored Azov, said that a sniper from the separatist side fired from the upper floors of hospital at Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. After the fighting, the military withdrew from the city, leaving it completely under the control of the demonstrators. They retained control over the checkpoints surrounding the city. According to the pro-Russian version, on April 30th, a new police chief, a Kiev protege, Valery Andryshuk, who I already mentioned, was sent to the city. He was given the order to clear the city of activists and prevent a demonstration in honor of Victory Day. The police refused to shoot at the demonstrators. Then Andreyshuk went completely crazy and wounded his subordinate with a pistol. Then he locked himself in his office, started shooting back at his own colleagues, and contacted the Banderids, the so-called National Guard, which was sitting in a military unit. He called them for help. They rolled up in APC and razed the police building to dust. The police burned alive in the building. They shot back as long as they could. They called for help, but there was nothing they could do. Fire trucks were not allowed near the building for over 3 hours. And then the Black Guards drove straight through the city center, shooting people on the sidewalks who were just walking to Victory Day. Andreyshuk managed to leave the police building, but was attacked by local residents. He received very serious injuries but survived. People still honoring the memory about militiamen who refused to suppress the protesters, and every year citizens bring flowers to the building of militia at 9th of May.
Они звонили, просили о помощи, что их атакует правый сектор, Нацгвардия. Просили о помощи, помогите там, да, до последнего, держались пацаны. Но их просто тупо расстреляли с БМП, с орудия. По людям стреляют с боевых бронированных машин. Нормально это? Скажите мне, пожалуйста. И поверьте, пожалуйста, мне, в нашем городе нету террористов, нету сепаратистов. Мы все мирные жители, понимаете? Мы живем, мы восточные, да, мы русские. Ну и что? Мы по-русски разговариваем, понимаете? Как можно нам навязывать, допустим, ту бандерскую фашистскую идеологию, понимаете? Ну все знают, все понимают. Нас просто предали и нас продали Америке с головой, понимаете? Им нужно для чего? Восток для чего? Здесь поставить натовские базы, понимаете? Диктовать условия России. Можете перевести.
You could definitely see the buildings come under some pretty heavy fire, as well as bullet holes. It looks like sort of shell-sized craters from maybe heavy weaponry. Very difficult to ascertain what's gone on down here at the police HQ, but what is clear is that a number of people have been killed and the building's been totally gutted after this firefight. Firefighters are still struggling, and a lot of people showing us sort of evidence of what happened here. Bullet casings, ammunition pouches, and crowd are really, really angry here, obviously. So there has been trouble in Mariupol before, but this is about as serious as it's gotten. And on Victory Day, I think this really could mean that things might get a lot worse here.
Эта национальная гвардия напала на нашу милицию. Что им не понравилось, я не знаю. Ну, сразу перестреливались просто из автоматов, а потом уже начали стрелять. Приехали БТРы и танки и стреляли. Вот это ужас просто. Они не национальная гвардия, они хуже фашистов. Стыд и позор нашей армии. Она вообще не наша.
So just to the left-hand side of the burning police HQ is a dead body on the grass here, covered by blankets. A number of people have been killed. We're still trying to figure out what's actually gone on here today, how many people have been killed. But it's pretty grim scenes down here in Mariupol. The city council building that's been changing hands between the Ukrainian military, the police and the protesters here. Burning barricades now outside the front. Part of the building looks like it's also been set on fire. Windows smashed. There's a big crowd down the road. It looks like the protesters here have got themselves an APC. I'm not sure where they've got this from or whether it works, but it's certainly theirs.
Да что вы прикалываетесь? Они здесь потом
Хуярить. Для нас снимай. Это для нас шло.
Смотрите,
Глаз.
Just move back slightly, I think.
Куда ты снимаешь?
У меня был автомат. Я террорист.
Я вот, смотри.
И вот террорист, смотрите.
смотрите.
Где террорист?
Вот,
Вот, дай я подойду, пистолет.
Вот, вот я, где
террорист? Смотри, где террорист?
Я сегодня с утра в костюме был на параде. Праздновали праздник. А они заехали с центра и начали тут стрелять. Мы пошли мирно с демонстрацией, людьми пошли. И они начали в них стрелять.
On the night of May 10th, the city council was set on fire and partially burned down. It remained in this condition until 2019, when the European Bank invested money to repair it. But it was not possible to restore it in 2 years, so now Russia is doing this. Because of the events of May 9th, which resulted in the death of people, the Mariupol City Council declared May 10th a day of mourning. A broken infantry fighting vehicle captured the day before was set on fire by unknown persons and burned down. During the fire, the ammunition in the infantry fighting vehicle began to explode, injuring several people. On this IFV, the protesters wrote, "Bitches, this is for Odessa." The National Guard left behind 2 armored personnel carriers, 3 trucks and other military equipment. A new chief of the city police was appointed, Oleg Morgun, who is now the mayor of Mariupol, and he also helped organize the DPR administration in Novoazovsk. On the evening of May 10th, a military unit and the city prosecutor's office were set on fire. On May 11th, a referendum was held through the DPR. In Mariupol, 4 polling stations were opened where long queues formed. No protests with the police or opponents of the referendum were registered. As a result, the majority of city residents voted for separation from Ukraine. There are a huge number of photos and videos of crowds of Mariupol residents on the referendum.
A vy za kogo?
Умничка, молодец.
Oh, it was so nice. A vy budete голосовать за кого сегодня? За кого?
За ДНР.
За кого?
За референдум.
Ну, за Украину или за Донецкий республик?
За республику.
За республик?
Все за республику.
А, все за республик? Это да. Спасибо.
Улица Артема. Вниз. Кэлла.
О, наконец. Передайте Америке, что не
I couldn't find any information on the internet about the months between the referendum and the assault by the Ukrainian army, so I asked some people who I know. There was anarchy in the city, shops and ATMs were often robbed, there was no Ukrainian or DPR police. However, there was no catastrophe. People went to work, there was food in the shops, public transport worked, and factories worked too. The city lived. That's why I didn't find any information. There is just nothing to say about this period. On June 1st, near the city council, DPR supporters chose the people's mayor, Alexander Fomenko. But 12 days later, on June 13th, Azov battalion with the support of armored vehicles captured all the buildings that were controlled by DPR rebels. By the end of the day, Ukrainian flags were raised over the administrative buildings of Mariupol. As a result of the operation, 5 DPR fighters were killed and several dozen were arrested. The DPR had very few soldiers, so the assault was short. The confrontation in Mariupol was over. In August and September, the DPR tried to recapture Mariupol, but they couldn't. Frontline was a few kilometers away and the situation was tense. In January 2015, Ukrainian army organized a massive shelling of the eastern part of the city, most likely to punish people for rebellion. At least 31 people were killed as a result of the shelling. Few months later, the conflict was frozen and next 7 years, Mariupol lived under Ukraine. The most popular question about politics that I heard from many people in Mariupol is why Russia didn't help us in 2014. Like, the only region that was saved without blood was Crimea, and it's living much better than with Ukraine. So why Russia didn't do the same to Donbas? Back then, Russia didn't recognize the referendum, and for next 8 years, DPR lived even worse than Ukraine. Many Mariupol citizens consider this a betrayal, and this is why some people here hate both Russia and Ukraine equally. Official reason is that Russian economy and industry weren't prepared for real sanctions, and the West could just make Russia collapse. For example, by disabling SWIFT system, which back then had no alternative. But of course, there could be other reasons. Anyway, if Russia would send troops in 2014, this war would not have happened, and hundreds of thousands or even millions of people would be alive. Now I want to say a few words about people's attitude towards Ukraine. This is a short video from Mariupol 2014, where a guy salutes Slava Ukraini to people on streets.
Слава Україні! Слава Україні! Слава Україні!
Чего хотите?
Слава Україні!
Пойдите, проходите. Да.
Слава Україні! Слава Україні!
А что говорить надо?
Слава Україні! Слава Україні! Слава Україні!
Слава.
Неправильный ответ. Что ты сказал?
Вы меня дрессируете?
Нет, Слава Україні!
And here you can see Mariupol citizens poured paint on the Ukrainian propaganda posters in 2015. I also like this very short video from one of Azov parades. Now let's take a look at article from Ukrainskaya Pravda, which is 100% nationalist source that supported new Kiev government. So according to this article from November 2014, in May 2014, 70% of Mariupol residents supported DPR. The article is also saying that many people in the city are still pro-Russian, and the most important, that many people in Mariupol are going missing. Even these Ukrainian reporters are saying that the majority of the population is convinced that the Ukrainian army or volunteer battalion fighters are kidnapping residents. And Deputy Chief of Defense Staff of Mariupol saying, recently we have registered about 10 requests regarding missing people. In 4 cases, the missing persons were found in the SBU. It turned out that they were involved in the actions of DPR and Novorossiya. And this is a Ukrainian propaganda article. The reality is much worse. Now it's confirmed that SBU kidnapped pro-Russian people and tortured them in the basements of Mariupol airport in the place called Biblioteka. If you are interested to know details, you can watch Krasmazov documentary about the Azov. Unfortunately, only auto translation from YouTube is available. He uses an information from the report of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2015. It's really interesting how now everyone forgot about it. You can find these reports in my Telegram channel. There are also stories of some people who somehow survived all of this. I think the crimes of Azov have to be remembered. Also, when I interviewed a volunteer from Mariupol, he also confirmed that SBU and Azov tortured and killed people in Mariupol airport. Some of his friends were there. Here you can see a billboard in Mariupol in 2016 asking to report about separatists to SBU. Many pro-Russian Mariupol citizens fled to Russia or to Europe because it was too dangerous for them to stay. Of course, Ukraine started a crazy propaganda campaign in Mariupol. Hundreds of events, parades, billboards everywhere. Here you can see murals symbolizing peace. And here you can see a Ukrainian soldier who wrote all the best for children on a shell. What a good person he is. Also, Ukrainian propaganda tried to make Mariupol citizens think that we are better than guys on the other side. That people in Donetsk are worse, that we are Ukrainians and they are separatists. By the way, Ukraine really tried to make Mariupol look beautiful. Maybe I will make video about this because it's a big topic, but in short, they made few places in the city look beautiful, while completely forgetting about like 90% of the city. Ukraine focused on cosmetical things like installing new benches and trash cans, at the same time neglecting basic infrastructure like sewerage. Apartment buildings also weren't overhauled since Soviet times. If you want to see a video about this, let me know in the comments. So this is how Mariupol rebelled against the nationalist government. Now it's almost forgotten, especially on the west, many materials are deleted, and most of people don't even know about these protests. Ukrainian propaganda is either silent, like nothing happened in Mariupol, or saying that all of this was done by Russian special services, and almost no locals participated. In Ukrainian propaganda there is no second opinion, as always. And Russian propaganda, as always, is much closer to reality, despite it's also one-sided. For example, there is no mention that there were pro-Ukrainian Mariupol citizens. Anyway, I hope these events will not be forgotten, because it's necessary to know about them to understand this conflict. This video took me a lot of efforts to make, so you can support me on Boosty. Thanks for watching!